So our next presentation is entitled Risk Reduction, a Third-Party Perspective. And Foy Mills was going to make that presentation. He's a senior consultant with Jla Associates, and he's had academic and administrative positions at Lubbock Christian University and Sam Houston State University. So Foy, come on.
Okay, thank you. I wonder what Amy was thinking when I was looking over her shoulder while she was trying to get all of this sorted out. Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you today. I am Foy Mills, and my title will effectively change at the beginning of August 1 as I assume role as VP for Ag Systems for JLA International. I've just concluded a 41-year career in higher education, most recently as provost at Lubbock Christian University. And so this is a nice respite from having to herd multiple faculty through COVID and other things. So it's my pleasure to be with you today. Wanted to look and address not only sustainability, but also risk reduction from our perspective as we help to serve the industry. First of all, I want to thank David Jordan for inviting me to share with you today. I'm grateful for the invitation. Thank you, David. I also want to thank those within JLA International who reviewed this presentation. First of all, David DeShazo, our Director of Ag Services, who is with us today, Dr. Jack Davis, our Director of Technical Services, Mike Jackson, our President of JLA, and Jim Leake, Chairman, who started all of this back in 1990. Unable to be with us today, and also want to acknowledge my other JLA International colleagues who are here present today. I also have several former colleagues and former students in the audience, and so thank you for being here. There is actually a definition for sustainable agriculture. It's under U.S. Code Title VII, Section 3103, and this delineates information related to that. But the one that I like is actually a result of this. I'll share this with you. Sustainability rests on the principle that we must meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Therefore, stewardship of both natural and human resources is of prime importance. One of the things I'm very appreciative of is I am able to be just like the rest of you in person today, is to see the young faces of both men and women within the organization. At one time, both Victor and I were the young faces at these meetings, and now, though Victor doesn't show it, my gray hair, and I'm beginning to not have quite as much of it as I once did, but we're so grateful for the influx of the new energy, because it's our young folks who are coming into the industry now that are part of this sustainability, part of the stewardship of what we have for the future. The first thing I want to acknowledge is the partnerships that JLA has had with the industry since Jim formed it in 1990. Without the partnerships among farmers, growers associations, our sheller friends, manufacturers, we would have been unable to attain some of the things that we believe that we've been able to do to help the overall industry. The things I want to address today is we were looking at a different world when JLA was established in 1990. I'll talk a little bit about aflatoxin because that is where we cut our teeth. I want to address risk and uncertainty, and I'm an ag economist by training, one of the few in this room. Nathan Smith, I think you and I are the only two in here today, and want to look at that from our perspective, the types of risk that we face. I want to use COVID as an example of whether we're really talking about uncertainty or risk. We will address business risk, a third-party evaluation. I want to talk a little bit about risk ID reduction mitigation, something called the necessary and sufficient conditions, our third-party support that we have tried to provide to the industry over the years, and ultimately the customer, who we all answer to, and to realize that all of this is integrated. Now, I have difficulty with the King's English, and so for those of you who may speak French, you may be able to clearly understand what this French writer, Jean-Baptiste Alphonse Carr, said in 1849, but in English, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I've been a part of the industry long enough to know from my early days at the University of Georgia, when I was part of the peanut team in 87 through 89. In 1989, I had the opportunity to work with the folks over at the Dawson Lab. There's actually a couple of pictures in there. You will see Chris Butts at an earlier age. You'll see me back when I had hair and it was dark. But in 1989, I was part of the Peanut Quality Enhancement Project. We were dealing with aflatoxin. We were looking at what belt screening might do to help reduce the issues with aflatoxin in the industry. Well, as the economist on the team, and when I quoted at Coronado Hotel out in San Diego that it was going to cost us $37 million, you could have heard a pin drop. Anyway. And so because of cost, and to some degree, we were unwilling to address that from that perspective. But then 1990 rolls around. And for those of you that have been around as long as I have, we historically have hated years that ended in zero. Because any year ending in zero, we could just anticipate we were going to have an aflatoxin issue. And that was the case in 1990. We had a very different U.S. peanut world. There were 1.8 million acres harvested that year. Our average yield across the U.S. was less than 2,000 pounds per acre. We generated a 1.8 million farm stock ton crop that year. We lived under the quota system. Some of y'all remember that. Flow Runner and GK7 were dominant varieties. Flow Runner, the primary one. We had production differences across the U.S. West Texas was just emerging as a production area at that point, and Texas was the #2 producer of peanuts at that point, which is no longer the case. Mississippi had 3,800 acres. South Carolina had a little over 10,000. Arkansas had 1,400, and Missouri had none. And those are all more major players in peanut production these days. But in 1990, aflatoxin reared its ugly head. And in that year, with aflatoxin prevalent, we saw reduced yields and prices to farmers. We had segregation and shelling issues that our sheller friends had to deal with. And there were finished lots that actually had to be destroyed by various manufacturers, actually went to landfills because they could not move into the industry. So it was in this time frame that JLA was formed. And for those few of you in here that know Jim Leake, that's he there to your left. I think, I'm trying to remember, in that year he was probably about 45. But this was the first lab in Colquitt, Georgia, farmers, fertilizer, and milling. And we still have that lab today. But what Jim had been doing, he had been leading the Jif plant at Lexington. And he had been one of those who had to destroy a great deal of peanut butter and was trying to figure out how do we do better. And this goes to something that Victor said a moment ago, is quality begins in the field. And so we knew that we needed to come in to look at closer to the origin. And so that's where we get into risk and uncertainty. In the seminal work published by Frank H. Knight in 1921, the classic distinction between risk and uncertainty was actually published. His view on risk is basically we have multiple outcomes, but there is a certain amount of measurability among those outcomes. So for example, today, In Dallas, Texas, I can tell you there's a 0% probability it's going to rain. I got a note this morning from my wife that we just hit 45 100-degree days in Abilene, Texas, where I live. That is more, almost twice as many as we had in our drought year of 2011. So we do measure risk. Whenever we hear the forecast, okay, now this is going to show my age. I don't know how many of y'all watch the 10 o'clock news and watch the weather forecast, but going on the farm, I still watch the weather forecast to see what's going to happen. That's a probability. There is a risk assessment that is occurring. But we also deal with uncertainty, and Knight noted that there is insufficient information that is available for us really to estimate the probability of any outcome taking place. And there are different types of risks. The first one is business risk, which has several subcomponents to it: production, price, market, casualty. These are examples of business risk. We also have financial risk related to such things as we're dealing with now: inflation, higher interest rates. I got tickled this morning as I was looking about inflation going to a new high just in this current cycle. Those of us who have been around long enough to know that inflation was a whole lot higher in the late 1970s. And we dealt with the farm financial crisis in the early 80s because of that inflation, trying to get it under control as interest rates went to double digit. It was not unusual for our farmers to be paying 18% plus on production loans. Unfortunately, that's not the case today. And there's also strategic risk that we have to acknowledge. So let me just use this wonderful little virus as an example. I know that I don't know if you're like me, but I really, we're at a point that we think pre-COVID and post-COVID. Hopefully we're thinking post-COVID. This virus has just really rocked all of our worlds. And so in October of 2019, as we were beginning to hear the first messages coming out of China, there really wasn't anything measurable. This was really a rare catastrophic mode of risk. And so to some level, there was a great deal of uncertainty. But I would suggest to you today, just in the short time that we've had to deal with this pandemic, that we have actually been able to move from a place of pretty abject uncertainty to the ability already to provide some predictability and some risk assessments of what's occurring. So this is an example of what it feels like to move from a level of uncertainty to some ability to measure risk. And so what type of risk are we really dealing with? And in my estimation, we're dealing with business risk. And from our perspective with JLA is how do we help our partners in the industry to reduce the risk that are associated with doing business? Now, whether you realize it or not, whenever we even think about our grading systems here in the United States, when we think about USDA Ag Marketing Service, all of our grading systems in the United States, particularly for nuts, are voluntary. Farmers do not have to grade their peanuts. But generally, if you wanted to go into the market and to have a market designation and to be able to be sold in general categories, you're going to go through the grading process. But again, it is done by an independent third party here, USDA AMS. And so as we look at it from our perspective, not USDA AMS, but as someone who is attempting to support and to help the entire industry, how do we identify, how to reduce, and hopefully mitigate risk? One thing that I want to remind everyone in this audience, and especially the folks who are doing research, is we're in the repeat purchase business. Whether we're a farmer, whether we're a sheller, whether we're a manufacturer, whether we're allied services, the product that goes into consumers' mouth, if they're going to eat it the second time and the third time and the fourth time and on, they have to have a consistent experience. And so that is a reason why all of us working together have to think about how do we reduce the risk of a bad experience. And there's been a great deal of work done on that over the last 30 years. We have worked with butter manufacturers, we've worked with salters, we've worked with confectioners, and you have all been in a situation, hopefully much less so today than at one time, that there's a difference between eating butter and a single nut product. Because with butter, sometimes that flavor thing, you can kind of subdue it. But if you get one bad peanut in a bag of peanuts, whether it's coated with chocolate or otherwise, you're going, do I want to eat another one of those? And so you might extend some grace the first time, but with time, you may extend less grace. So who is JLA? We've actually been around, as I noted, since 1990, and I've had the privilege of working with Jim and the team since 1991 when I did the first feasibility study on what we were looking at in the expansion of peanuts out here in Texas, specifically West Texas. We've dealt with crop research, analytical and micro testing. We work with safety analysis, systems development, research and development. But what we base our treatise on is we need to go to the origin. We need to go to the very beginning to help as much as possible. And we have tended to focus on high value, high risk, best managed at the origin, always thinking about the consumer and what their needs are. And so as we think about ourselves, as we think about our partnerships and risk reduction, so we're a technical service organization providing strategic quality assurance systems specializing in food safety and food quality. And we have a very well-trained team. We have food scientists, we have chemists, we have the economists, we have biologists and microbiologists, and so we're grateful for the team that we have. Since 1990, JLA has partnered with various segments of the U.S. international peanut industry to reduce risk associated with peanuts as a food ingredient. And that is a reminder that peanuts are a food ingredient. JLA, and now JLAI, has put measurement systems in place to estimate the probability of various outcomes related to food safety and food quality assurance to assist the industry with providing the safest, most nutritious, and flavorful peanut products to the consumer. To give you an example, this is a note from 1993 that Jim sent out to some of our clients, a risk assessment that we were doing in 1993, and this was specifically noting some things that were happening here in the Southwest growing region, and Jim also notes things that were happening in the Southeast at that point. So as we think about risk reduction, and this is from my background as an economist, it's something called the necessary and sufficient condition. A necessary condition is one that must be present for an event to occur. A sufficient condition is one that will actually produce the event. So let me unpack that for just a moment. A necessary condition in what we deal with in the peanut industry is the product safe. If the product is not safe, it is not going to go to the shelf. It's not going to be accepted. We cannot release it. So historically, JLA has dealt with aflatoxin and helping the industry move the needle on that. But as I alluded to earlier, some things just don't go away. What we actually experienced in 2019 is probably the worst, well, it is for me, it is the worst aflatoxin year I've experienced in my 30 plus years with the peanut industry. And even though it existed more recently, we've had to deal with foodborne pathogens, Salmonella being one of those. So let me begin with aflatoxin. Here are some of the things that we believe that we've tried to help the industry with. First of all is origin certification. Is the end user knowing that that product coming from a specific location is verified and is safe from aflatoxin. And I will have to say, our friends and our colleagues in Argentina do a great job with this. They track and monitor that product all the way to it being placed on containers going to Europe. We also were involved in the development of the Dutch code that helped us get peanuts into the EU specifically the early 90s by rethinking our testing here in the U.S. When Jim, in his early days, began to look at key production regions, we have labs across the U.S. We also have laboratories in Argentina. I had developed a lab in China and also in Brazil, major production areas. We also considered at one time going into India, but the situation there was pretty complex. We also have a program that we developed with First Alert, where we look at forecasting of aflatoxin risk in any crop in any given year. We also have been involved in training folks at regrade labs, at shelling facilities to help them as they looked at aflatoxin. And we also have really worked on developing the vertical cutter method as a JLA method for trying to homogenize and have a better idea and feel for aflatoxin's presence in any lot of peanuts, reminding us all that what is key is sampling. We're dealing with large lots, and sampling is critical to that. And then, as I mentioned a moment ago, foodborne pathogens, and we have all experienced that here more recently. In fact, the Food Safety Modernization Act of 2010, I would suggest to you, was really finally pushed over the edge by what happened with the Peanut Corp of America. And with that salmonella outbreak and the adulteration of peanut butter moving into the system, even when they knew what the results were, really pushed this forward. And it was about this time the JLA, even though we had microbiology capabilities, the Institute of Environmental Health out of Seattle acquired JLA in 2011, and their expertise is in microbiology. So it has increased our breadth and depth of hopefully support of the industry. One of the things that Jim coined back early on that we really believed in, depending on which part of the country, some call it GERBIS, some call it GERBIS. Here it is. It's getting it right before it ships. We want to make sure that whatever we are shipping to manufacturers meets their needs. We want to eliminate surprises. We do know that if we can identify what is occurring, that people may be able to handle it. So sometimes just identifying what is present can help us greatly. We always want to be a reliable third party with unbiased results. Data is data. Data communicates. We will interpret it, and we have made recommendations, but ultimately that data is shared with the appropriate persons for them to make business decisions. And then again, that goes back to the risk that any specific organization is willing to bear. We want to make sure that we have credibility within the industry and as those products move forward through the supply chain. So we talked about the necessary condition, is it safe? But the sufficient condition, does it taste good? From a physical perspective, from a chemical perspective, and from an organoleptic perspective. So consumer acceptability. First of all, is roasting. One of the things that we deal with is roasting variability. And for those of the manufacturers that may be here, you know some of the things that you've dealt with as varieties change and sizes change. We've also dealt and helped with processing. We have sensory panels dealing with flavor, off flavors, and mouthfeel. We've also helped with product development. So what are some of these type of supports that we've done? And here's some selected examples. It's hard to believe I edit and write for our newsletter called In a Nutshell. This is volume 29. And 2 seasons preceded that as peanut pointers. And so this is information from the major growing regions that I share twice a month. We look at yield, tonnage, and quality estimates. Back in '92, we began what we call the characterization study, where we looked at materials coming directly out of the field at harvest, where we could characterize what was happening. We followed the next year in the Southeast in '93, and we began to realize that peanuts are not interchangeable. You could plant the same variety in the Southeast and the same variety in the Southwest, and physiologically they were different. Some of that was due in large part to environmental conditions. We found that we could plant the same peanut in Seminole, Texas, and you could plant it in Pearsall, Texas, and it looked different because of altitude and growing degree days and temperature, nighttime temperature. So we've learned a lot through that. I don't know whether this is famous or infamous. We dealt with the sandwich digger, looking at ways to help protect peanuts after they were dug from fluctuations in temperature. Looked at shelf life studies, food safety and sanitation training. I've dealt with agriculture policy and implications because of my background and shared that information over the years with various folks. We've dealt with drying research, first in the field because of the fruity, soured, overripe off note that we often see, unfortunately, in the Southwest, especially in West Texas. We also did some of the original work with Texas Tech on large capacity drying trailers. We looked at subsurface drip irrigation and found out very quickly that it don't work for peanuts. If y'all could have seen some of the samples that arrived into our laboratory, especially coming out of West Texas, it just doesn't work. Storage facility studies, we've dealt with identified changes in maturity profiles post TSWB, and learning how to help manage 2 to 3 distinct crops in the Southeast. When I was on the peanut team back in '87, pretty much everything was out of the ground by the end of September. Well, that's not the case anymore because everything was planted in April. Now, some of it might be planted in April, some of it mid-May, some of it in June, and those crops are all maturing at different times. We also developed a seed index. We looked and helped with the variety development, helping support breeders with the work that they were doing. First, through conversations about the UPPT. I remember when Jim and I had conversations with Howard Ballantyne many years ago about what that could look like, and then Howard and USDA ran with that. We've also, as I mentioned just a moment ago, worked with breeders. We've done form material studies, one of the more recent ones, and this has nothing to do with grading, but we have something we call sounds and uglies. And we've been working with those, and basically an ugly is something you wouldn't want to put in your mouth, but it rides a screen and it's sellable within the industry. But we're finding out some interesting things about those ugly peanuts. Also, we've looked at electronic eye efficacy studies, and we continually are doing weather monitoring. Also, leadership development, facility audits, aflatoxin coating management reporting, size distribution projects, microbiology, high-speed oleic acid analysis and purification, and high-speed single kernel quality assessments, thanks to my colleague, Dr. Davis, and the work that he is doing and our other folks with JLA. Now, this is a picture of the slab of the new house that my wife is a residential contractor, and this is the slab which was poured 2.5 weeks ago in Abilene, Texas, where we have returned to. And it already is dried in, if you can believe that. But we have to have solid support. You have to have that solid foundation. Our products must be safe, and they must be good tasting with all of the attributes that the consumer is presently wanting. And so without all of this work and the partnerships that we have been pleased to engage with in the industry, we've not been able to, in our estimation, to help in the ways that we could. But the thing that I want us to always remember, it is the customer whom we always must be mindful of, because they're the ones upon whom we depend for the products that we are so interested in with peanuts. Thank you for your attention today. It's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you, David.
While we're switching over, we've got time for a quick question if there is one. Okay, seeing none, thanks. Okay.